reports on this as they unfold. All right, so earlier in the month of June, U.S. Department of Energy Deputy Secretary David Turk led a delegation to visit Nairobi, Kenya, and Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, to discuss issues related to clean energy, carbon management, and incentivizing foreign direct investment in Africa's energy sector. Now, at the end of his visit in Kenya, he sat down in an interview with the Standard Group economy editor Peter Wakaba, who started by asking him what his trip had been able to achieve. Let's take a look.
It's been a pleasure to come to Kenya and spend a few days meeting with a whole range of folks. We met with government cabinet secretaries, but also a lot of private sector folks, private sector entrepreneurs and leaders. And the real purpose of this visit is to really follow up on President Ruto's state visit. And I work at the U.S. Department of Energy. My career has been in clean energy. And we're doing an awful lot on clean energy and industrial clean energy development in our country. And there's such a huge opportunity here in Kenya. And it's such a natural partnership in so many ways, building off of decades of bilateral partnership on a whole range of issues. But as we're building out our clean energy economy, Kenya is already a clean energy powerhouse. We're very envious of 93% of your electricity being generated already by renewables. But what I heard here consistently from government folks, from private sector folks is, boy, the opportunity here is just enormous for clean energy jobs, clean energy industry. That's good for Kenya, and it's frankly good for the rest of the world too.
So it's interesting that you've talked about energy. Kenya and the region has some of the most expensive energy in the world comparatively. What then would have to happen in terms of policy and direction to start to get these prices to come down and make it more affordable even for industry?
So energy has to be clean and it has to be affordable. It has to be reliable and resilient as well. And so we're spending an awful lot. Under President Biden's leadership, we've gotten some extraordinary legislation to drive down the cost of clean energy and clean energy technologies and clean energy supply chains and manufacturing across the board. So on electric mobility, on clean hydrogen, on geothermal, on wind, on the grid. The grid is so important to make sure that supply meets up with demand and it's done efficiently. So we're driving down costs. And that's part of the conversation we had here as we do things at scale in the U.S. and learn. How can we share that learning? How can we share that success to Kenya and vice versa as well? And I think clean energy is one of those areas. The more affordable we make it in one place, the more affordable it is in another place. And so there's really some true mutually beneficial partnership on the clean energy side here between our countries.
You've talked about e-mobility and really interesting developments here in Kenya. But part of what is happening is that in the recent financial proposals going into the budget, there is a tax proposed on batteries that drives the price up really high. What do you think needs to happen in terms of policy that can then enable investors extrapolate or project that kind of thing over a long duration so that their investment can then be sustainable and start to make sense?
So let me first of all say that from meeting with private sector entrepreneurs, certainly in two-wheelers and electric buses, but also in passenger vehicles, but also meeting with government ministers and other leaders, I think the opportunity for e-mobility is an absolute no-brainer and a huge potential to scale up incredibly quickly here in Kenya. Just from an economics perspective, the fact that you have such abundant clean energy resources. We've got to keep working on affordability. Every country needs to work on affordability to make sure that that clean energy is affordable. But having that electric mobility fueled by the already clean electric grid and additional clean energy assets that can be brought on with an improved grid and making sure that we're all doing what we need to do on the grid side of things is so much more cost competitive than having to import fossil fuels, whether it's diesel or other fossil fuels. It saves consumers money, it saves businesses money who are operating the buses and operating the two-wheeler fleets in terms of passenger delivery and food delivery and other kinds of delivery services. It's also great for Kenya from an energy security and an economic security to have that homegrown energy powering your transportation as opposed to having to bring in fossil fuels and be dependent on unpredictable prices of global commodities like oil. And so to me, there's a no-brainer opportunity, and that seemed to be shared by everyone that we spoke with, and some really interesting, I think, exciting entrepreneurs and exciting business opportunities, including more and more of the value chain of actually putting those EVs together here in Kenya. Huge number of jobs done right, and some interesting partnerships with other countries, including Tata from India, on the e-bus side of things, in terms of, again, some more. I'm a firm believer that countries should benefit from their natural resources as much as possible and get the full value from those natural resources. So as Kenya switches over to e-mobility, having more and more of that assembly, more and more of the parts coming from Kenya, where the jobs can be Kenyan, and it seemed like there was some real opportunity on that front. To answer your question directly, policy really matters. That's what we're finding out in the U.S. context with the policy that President Biden's been able to put in place to have the tax incentives, to have the grants, to have the loans, to have the work on grids, and to make sure that our grids are as efficiently as they can be to drive down the cost of electricity in our country. And policy matters in the Kenyan context as well. And so what we can do is, as an agency, as a department that's working on policy in our country, share our experiences that might be helpful for decision makers here in Kenya, and vice versa, learn from the Kenyan experience. But policy does matter, no doubt about it.
A lot has been said about critical minerals, especially in the energy sector, and the fact that Kenya has recently had discoveries of things like coltan and others. Now, what exactly needs to happen so that we can then have the conversation around not just getting these minerals out of the ground, but also starting to discuss beneficiation and value addition so as to leave more of the value here in this country?
Yeah, so we did have a lot of conversations along those lines, and we've had that conversation with other countries in Africa and Latin America and elsewhere. And I think what you'll see from the United States is a true partnership model where it's actually in our interests, our economic interests, certainly our diversification of supply chains, to have Kenya, to have other countries benefit from their critical minerals, do the processing, work up the value chain. That's good for the United States, but it's also good for Kenya, and frankly, it's good from a diversification of supply chains around the world.
Let's talk about Sola and the fact that, while Kenya is abundantly blessed with a lot of sun and a lot of wind, and indeed the whole energy mix, one of the challenges for solar in this country is the quality of solar panels, the duration which they will last, thus driving up cost and driving down uptake. Now, in terms of policy and sharing of skills, sharing of technology, what can be done so as to start to see the kind of quality, the kind of development that we have witnessed in the United States start to percolate here in this country?
Well, it's the quality, it's the technology and the innovative technology to get more power per panel, right? And we're working on those chemistries to try to have the cutting edge on it. And it's the business model and then the economic enabling environment as well. And I think there's all sorts of ways to learn from each other in that context. We're doing an awful lot on that in the United States, including trying to make it easier for consumers to get the solar on their roof. So you can do it in a few weeks, a few months period of time, as opposed to having to go through a whole bunch of red tape that takes literally months and in some cases years. So there's a lot of shared experience on that front. But Kenya is blessed with not only geothermal, wind, solar, you name it in terms of renewables. And our interest from the United States is how can we help Kenya and Kenyans develop those resources for their own benefit, for their own economic benefit. And that's frankly how we solve climate change too, is if countries around the world can get economic benefits from clean energy, just as President Ruto has spoken so eloquently about. That's how we solve climate change. It's a positive narrative, but even more importantly, it's a positive force for good in the world.
All right, and now to some news that we are getting at this moment in the newsroom is that President William Ruto is expected to